In the following study, we will be revisiting some of the points covered in the previous Rise and Fall of the King of the Norse study. It is intended to help answer some questions that were raised regarding some of those points. But before proceeding, I will say a short word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray for heavenly eye salve, that we all may see more clearly the events connected with the imminent return of your Son Jesus, and his work in the heavenly sanctuary, and that we may be found with his garments of righteousness, the whole armor of God. I pray for unity in the Spirit, that we may have the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God. And I pray this in your Son Jesus' most glorious and holy name. Amen. All right, I will now begin this study with this statement by James White, where I read, "We had the curiosity not long since to compare all the books on unfulfilled prophecy within our reach, to see how far they were agreed as to the precise position which the present generation occupies in prophecy. The writers belong to so many schools of interpretation that we were not at all disappointed in discovering that there were very few points in which they were agreed, and the comparison was not by any means confirmatory of the idea that prophecies were intended to be understood in their details before they are fulfilled. We are aware that there seems to be a blessing pronounced upon him who reads and understands them, but it is a blessing which we fear, but very few in this age of the church can claim." Now, what we can glean from this statement is that there were many expositions of prophecy that were claiming to reveal the details of prophetic events before they were fulfilled. And as it is stated, the Bible does pronounce a blessing on those who read and understand prophecy. But as far as understanding the details leading up to that fulfillment, we can only make our best educated guesses with the information available at present. And it is only when a prophetic event has passed into history can we then look back and discover the details that led up to its fulfillment. And it is only then that we can understand the precise position our generation occupies in prophecy. The problem with Christianity today is that we believe we can know all the details of a prophecy before it takes place. Don't get me wrong, we are to watch and examine the events taking place around us and what role they may play. But we spend far too much time speculating about current events and how they may fulfill prophecy. There are so many sensational scenarios out there, it boggles the mind. And instead of looking to history through the lens of prophecy, the only place where it is possible to know every detail of any prophecy, we have in this day become more like news anchors than good students of prophecy. It is important to remember here that Sister White, like many of the inspired patriarchs and prophets, didn't fully grasp the full import of everything that God revealed to her, and that the details of these prophecies would not be fully understood or revealed until the events themselves had transpired. And with that, we will commence with the study. A brother has raised a question regarding Daniel 12:1, specifically the phrase "at that time." This brother has put forward the idea that the time here mentioned, "at that time," is referring to the time of the end, or the end of the 1260-year prophecy, which ended in 1798, as is mentioned in Daniel 11:40. Something else being questioned is how the time of trouble could possibly last for over 100 years. We will also be addressing the belief that the Eastern question was not resolved with the Treaty of Lausanne and is still a legitimate issue today. And by God's grace, this study will help to clarify these questions that were raised. Now, out of respect for this brother and for all those with differing opinions and points of view, I want to make it clear that I am not dogmatic, and that this study, or any of my studies for that matter, are not about proving anyone wrong, but are, Lord willing, a means to help my brothers and sisters to see something that they may have missed, and above all, to uplift Jesus, that we may have unity in the faith, and that we may be better prepared to meet Jesus when he comes. Now, before digging into this study, ask yourself this: if the time we're now living in is as the days of Noah, and the entire antediluvian world being given a 120-year period of probation, does it not stand to reason that God would be just as long-suffering with those living today and provide an equal amount, if not more time, to seek shelter? With that, we will look at Daniel and the Revelation, page 293, and the chapter titled Closing Scenes, where we start with Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. A definite time is introduced in this verse, not a time revealed in names or figures, which specify any particular year or month or day, and that would include 1798. But a time made definite by the occurrence of a certain event with which it stands connected. At that time, what time? The time to which we are brought by the closing verse of the preceding chapter, the time when the king of the north shall plant the tabernacles of his palace in the glorious holy mountain, or in other words, when the Turk, driven from Europe, shall hastily make Jerusalem his temporary seat of government. Okay, here we are told that this time is a definite time, which is connected to an event, and is not a time revealed in names or figures, which specify any particular year or month or day. According to this understanding, the time of the end of 1798 is not connected with the time mentioned in Daniel 12:1. That is because it was a particular year that was revealed in the 1260-year figure. It is also clear of what event is tied to this standing up of Michael, and that being the time when the king of the north shall plant the tabernacles of his palace in the glorious holy mountain, or in other words, when the Turk, driven from Europe, shall hastily make Jerusalem his temporary seat of government. Now, I have already covered this sequence of events in the rise and fall of the king of the north study, and won't spend too much time on that here. But these events have already taken place, just not in the order that was expected. The Ottoman government made the Augusta Victoria Hospital a temporary or auxiliary seat of its triumvirate government in 1914, and this was located on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. That is, 1/3 of the acting Ottoman government made the Augusta Victoria Hospital its temporary seat of government. This auxiliary form of government was equal to and sustained all the power of the triumvirate. And according to William Miller's rules, to know whether we have the true historical event for the fulfillment of a prophecy, if you find every word of the prophecy, after the figures are understood, is literally fulfilled, then you may know that your history is the true event. Again, what this statement is telling us is that the time of the end of Daniel 11:40 is not in the same context as the time mentioned in Daniel 12:1. But the question that remains is, why didn't Michael stand up and probation immediately close after the Turk set up his tabernacles? I believe we have part of our answer in this statement from early writings, which reads, "The commencement of that time of trouble here mentioned does not refer to the time when the plagues shall begin to be poured out, but to a short period just before they are poured out, while Christ is in the sanctuary. At that time, while the work of salvation is closing, trouble will be coming on the earth, and the nations will be angry, yet held in check so as not to prevent the work of the third angel. At that time, the latter rain or refreshing from the presence of the Lord will come, to give power to the loud voice of the third angel, and prepare the saints to stand in the period when the 7 last plagues shall be poured out." Now, the biggest issue that I've heard so far with the Ottoman collapse fulfilling Daniel 11:45 is that Michael must stand up and that probation must close shortly after, and that a 100-year interval of trouble between the collapse and standing up of Michael is just not possible. And this first statement by Sister White would seem to support that understanding. But let us first consider the following 2 statements here. And I read, "The temporal retribution upon Jerusalem could be delayed but a short period of time. A world is represented in the destruction of Jerusalem, and the warning given then by Christ comes sounding down the line to our time. And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity. the sea and the waves roaring. What we see in this second quote is that the 40 years, or an entire generation before the destruction of Jerusalem, is considered to be a short period of time. She then identifies this destruction as being typical of the destruction of the world. And knowing Jerusalem was given a short period of just 40 years before its destruction, we can safely say that a similarly short period would be given by God to the antitypical Jerusalem represented by the world. And in this last statement, I read, "Children, our life here is a short period at best. And what and whom are we living and working for? And what will be the outcome of it all?" What we find here is that our lifetime is a short period at best. At best, meaning that it is very brief. Now we can see how a 100 or even 180-year period of trouble is not at all that long, especially with man's time here on earth being that of a vapor, as we read in James 4:14. "Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time, and then vanisheth away." This short period mentioned by Sister White corresponds with the period of time necessary for the preparation and gathering of the kings of the East to make their last grand rally to the Holy Land, as stated in Daniel and the Revelation, page 649. And we will see this in the following slides. Now, there isn't quite enough time to get into this in this study, but in part 2, we will take a closer look at this word at that time as well, and whether or not immediacy is an inherent property of this word. We will now explore the significance of the sealing time and the work of the 4 angels of Revelation 7, who were commissioned to hold back the 4 winds. These 4 winds represent the climax of the trouble associated with the current war and strife in our world, that is being held in check until the mystery of God has been finished and the work of the investigative judgment completed. Then probation will close, and that restraint will finally be withdrawn. It is very important that we understand this sealing work and the work of these 4 angels in holding back the 4 winds, for it is essential in our understanding of why the time of trouble has lasted for over 100 years now. And with that, I will read these next statements. At a meeting held in Dorchester, Massachusetts, in November of 1848, I had been given a view of the proclamation of the sealing message, and of the duty of the brethren to publish the light that was shining upon our pathway. Now, for those who don't know, this sealing message was the light revealed in regard to the seventh-day Sabbath of the 4th commandment, and its being the seal of God. And moving on. Let the commandments of God and the testimony of Jesus Christ be in your minds continually, and let them crowd worldly thoughts and cares from the mind. When you lie down and when you rise up, let them be your meditation. Live and act wholly in reference to the coming of the Son of Man. The sealing time is very short and will soon be over. I saw that Satan was at work in these ways to distract, draw away, and deceive God's people just now in this sealing time. And skipping down to the bottom here, I saw that she, Mrs. Hastings, was sealed. She was sealed and would come up at the voice of God and stand upon the earth, and would be with the 144,000. I saw we need not mourn for her. She would rest in the time of trouble, and all that we could mourn for was our loss in being deprived of her company. I saw her death would result in good. What we find here is that the sealing time, the beginning of which many Adventists believe to still be future, actually began in 1848, and as we have just read, the sealing work was expected to be very short in duration. It is clear, though, that it had begun, and we can know this because Mrs. Hastings was sealed and will come up at the special resurrection and be with the 144,000. As we progress in this study, we will find that because of our unfaithfulness, this sealing was delayed. and that time was prolonged much longer than was initially expected. Here we have another quote from Sister White, where is described the scene of the sealing work, and it being about to close. But before the four angels could release the winds, another angel was commissioned to give a message to the other four angels, to continue holding back the four winds. And we read, I asked my attending angel the meaning of what I had heard, and what the four angels were about to do. He said to me that it was God that restrained the powers, that he gave his angels charge over things on the earth, and that the four angels had power from God to hold the four winds, and that they were about to let them go. And while they had started to let the four winds go, the merciful eye of Jesus gazed on the remnant who were not all sealed. Then he raised his hands to his Father and pled with him that he had spilled his blood for them. Then another angel was commissioned to fly swiftly to the four angels, and bid them hold until the servants of God were sealed in their foreheads. Now, what we should be asking is, why were the winds held back in the first place? We're told it is because the merciful eye of Jesus gazed on the remnant who were not all sealed. Then he raised his hands to the Father and pled with him that he had spilled his blood for them. And one more statement here. Then I saw an exceeding bright light come from God, who sat on the great white throne, and was shed all about Jesus. I saw an angel with a commission from Jesus swiftly fly to the other four angels, who had a work to do on the earth, and waving something up and down in his hand, and crying with a loud voice, Hold, 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 until the servants of God are sealed in their foreheads. We're told that the saints were not all sealed. Now, is this referring to those who are in the SDA church? We will find out here very shortly. The answer to our previous question can be gleaned from the next two statements, and I read, We should specially seek God for grace and power to be given to his people now. God lives, and we do not believe that the time has fully come when he would have our liberties restricted. The prophets saw four angels standing on the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. Another angel ascending from the east cried to them, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. This points out the work we now have to do, which is to cry to God for the angels to hold the four winds until missionaries shall be sent to all parts of the world, and shall have proclaimed the warning against disobeying the law of Jehovah. Our warfare is aggressive. Tremendous issues are before us, yea, and right upon us. Let our prayers ascend to God, that the four angels may be commissioned to hold the four winds, that they may not blow to injure or destroy until the last warning has been given to the world. Then let us work in harmony with our prayers. Let there be nothing in any of our institutions that will lessen the force of the truth for this time. Present truth is to be our burden. A great work is to be done. The third angel's message must do its work of separating from the churches a people who will take their stand on the platform of eternal truth. Okay, what we find here is that the remnant people, who are not all sealed, are not only those of our own denomination, but those who are a part of the fallen churches, and that it has been our duty to call these souls out from these churches. But as we shall see, we have neglected that great commission. And reading this next statement, four mighty angels are still holding the four winds of the earth. Terrible destruction is forbidden to come in full. The accidents by land and by sea, the loss of life steadily increasing, by storm, by tempest, by railroad disaster, by conflagration, the terrible floods, the earthquakes, and the winds will be the stirring up of the nations to one deadly combat. While the angels hold the four winds, forbidding the terrible power of Satan to be exercised in its fury until the servants of God are sealed in their foreheads. Get ready, I beseech you. Get ready before it shall be forever too late. The ministers of vengeance will pour all the terrible judgments upon a God-forsaken people. The way of obedience is the only path of life. May the Lord help you to see it in time, to open your ears, that you may hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. In this quote, we see that the winds are being held, but there is much destruction coming on the earth, and that this destruction is steadily increasing, which mirrors this statement from Sister White, which we will be exploring in greater detail as we progress in this study. The time of trouble has commenced. It has begun. The reason why the four winds have not let go is because the saints are not all sealed. It's on the increase and will increase more and more. The trouble will never end until the earth is rid of the wicked. In this next statement, we find that Sister White mentions the Spanish-American War, and that this war was causing uneasiness among the nations. Now, I won't get into all of the history of this war here for lack of time, but it was very significant in that it was the war that first brought America onto the world stage. And reading the quote, "Although there is much war and great and decisive action between Spain and America, and there is uneasiness in all the nations, the smiting of war and aggressive warfare, we feel that the angels still have hold of the four winds, and that the command will go forth, hold, hold, hold fast the four winds, that they shall not blow until the saints of God are sealed in their foreheads. There is a work to be done that is not yet done in preparing." Once again, there is a work to be done that is not yet done in preparing the people to stand in the great trials which will come upon sea and land. Now, in this quote, we have confirmation that the time of trouble, or the period in which the four angels are holding back the four winds, is the time necessary in which God's people are prepared to go through the last fiery trials. Trials that are designed to remove the dross of self from our characters, that we may be sealed and found worthy to escape the things that are to come on this earth. Okay, these next two quotes are very important, so please pay attention. And starting with the first. "We are warned in the Word of God that sleepless vigilance is the price of safety. Only in the straight path of truth and righteousness can we escape the tempter's power. The winds are held by the four angels. A moment of respite has been graciously given us of God. Every power lent us of God, whether physical, mental, or moral, is to be sacredly cherished to do the work assigned us for our fellow men who are perishing in their ignorance. The warning is to go forth to all parts of the world. There must be no delay." What we read here is that there is a moment of respite, or as the 1828 Webster's Dictionary puts it, in law, a reprieve, a temporary suspension of the execution of a capital offender. Now, God is long-suffering, and he is keeping the door of mercy open a little while longer for those who are under penalty of death for the transgression of his law, that they may hear the last warning message and repent and be saved. Again, we should be asking ourselves, why were the restraining angels ordered to hold back the winds in the first place? Why not just let the winds loose? We find out why in this next paragraph. And I read, "The Lord God is a jealous God, yet he bears long with the sins and transgression of his people in this generation. If the people of God had walked in his counsel, the work of God would have advanced. The messages of truth would have been borne to all people that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Had the people of God believed him and been doers of his word, had they kept his commandments, the angel would not have come flying through heaven with the message to the four angels that were to let loose the winds that they should blow upon the earth, saying, Hold, hold the four winds, that they blow not upon the earth until I have sealed the servants of God in their foreheads. But because the people are disobedient, unthankful, unholy, as were ancient Israel, time is prolonged, that all may hear the last message of mercy proclaimed with a loud voice. The Lord's work has been hindered, the sealing time delayed. Many have not heard the truth, but the Lord will give them a chance to hear and be converted, and the great work of God will go forward." Now, we read that had the people of God believed him and been doers of his word, had they kept his commandments, the angel would not have come flying through heaven with the message for the four angels to hold back the four winds, or the 7 last plagues. Understanding this, it makes perfect sense why Michael did not stand up and why the close of probation didn't happen immediately after the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 11, verse 45. It is because the sealing time was delayed and time prolonged. It has been extended, time has been extended for at least 176 years, from 1849 to the present time. We were told that there must be no delay, but because we did delay in giving the last warning message, God has graciously prolonged time, that all may hear the last message of mercy proclaimed with a loud voice, or the third angel's message when it swells to a loud cry and unites with the fourth angel. To sum this up, the sealing time was first mentioned in 1849, and then because of our being disobedient, unthankful, and unholy, the time allowed for the sealing message or third angel's message to reach the whole world has been prolonged up until the present time, 176 years later. This is a very short period in the eyes of God, and if a day is as 1,000 years, then 176 years would be a little less than 4 hours. Truly, man's life is but a vapor. Okay, now we just have 2 more slides to go, and we'll be through this first portion of the study. I know it's a lot of text to get through, but it is necessary in order to get the point across in this study, and I appreciate everyone's patience. But moving on. We are standing on the threshold of great and solemn events. Prophecies are fulfilling. Strange and eventful history is being recorded in the books of heaven. Events which it was declared should shortly precede the great day of God. Everything in the world is in an unsettled state. The nations are angry, and great preparations for war are being made. And once again, I want to point out here that you can see this, the nations being angry, being synonymous with this preparation for war. And again, this is synonymous with trouble. But I digress. Nation is plotting against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. The great day of God is hastening greatly. But although the nations are mustering their forces for war and bloodshed, the command to the angels is still in force, that they hold the 4 winds until the servants of God are sealed on their foreheads. And we see here this was recorded in 1909. And we find that these prophecies were fast fulfilling just previous to Sister White's passing, and that these prophecies have to do with nations and kingdoms plotting and preparing for war. What is taking place here is that Satan's forces, the kings of the east, which are the kings of the earth and of the whole world, they are being prepared to be gathered to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. And in this last statement we read, Satan sees that his time is short. He has set all his agents to work, that men may be deceived, deluded, occupied, and entranced until the day of probation shall be ended, and the door of mercy shall be forever shut. The time is right upon us, when there will be sorrow that no human balm can heal. Sentinel angels are now restraining the 4 winds, that they shall not blow till the servants of God are sealed in their foreheads. But when God shall bid his angels loose the winds, there will be a scene of strife such as no pen can picture. This was the last statement Sister White made regarding the 4 winds being held back until the sealing could be accomplished, and that was in 1912. We see that she was expecting that the close of probation was right upon them when the door of mercy would be shut forever, and that there would be no human balm that could heal the resulting sorrow. This would be the sorrow of the wicked after the realization that they had neglected the necessary preparation, and that they are now lost. What a terrible thought it is to imagine this scene. And God help us to share the last warning message, and that we may make the necessary preparations in our own lives in the time that we still have. Okay, this is the last slide where we will conclude this first portion of our study. And reading from Revelation verses 12 and 13. And the 6th angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. Now, I just want to quickly point something out here before moving on about the 3 unclean spirits. These 3 spirits are Satan's counter to the 3 angels' messages of Revelation 14. These 3 spirits go forth to the kings of the earth and of the whole world to gather them being the tares for the battle of Armageddon, and are then burned at the second coming. While the 3 angels of Revelation 14, they go forth to gather God's people, the wheat, for the harvest and for salvation at Christ's second coming. Okay, moving on. What we see is that the preparation mentioned here in verse 12, this preparation corresponds with this moment of respite for God's people that was mentioned by Sister White previously. And God, knowing the end from the beginning, he knew that his people would not be ready because of their disobedience, their unholiness, and their unthankfulness. Although the sealing time was delayed or paused as a result, it doesn't mean that prophecy itself has also been delayed or paused or put on hold. It was time itself that was prolonged or extended by God's grace. We have been given this moment of respite. But the prophetic order of things was not thrown off course because of our shortcomings, and a new course or trajectory plotted as a result. These prophecies of Daniel and Revelation were written with the foreknowledge of this delay and prolongation of time already taken into account, because, as was just stated, God knew we wouldn't be ready to give the last warning message. Prophecy has been marching on, and while the last events are happening right before our very eyes, we are sleeping right through them and thinking they are completely irrelevant, when they are anything but. Now, in this next quote, we read, "Angels are belting the world, refusing Satan his claims to supremacy, made because of the vast multitudes of his adherents. We hear not the voices, we see not with the natural sight the work of these angels, but their hands are linked about the world, and with sleepless vigilance they are keeping the armies of Satan at bay till the sealing of God's people shall be accomplished." And reading verse 14 of Revelation 16. "For they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty." And we can see here that these armies of Satan that are kept at bay, these armies are synonymous with the kings of the earth and of the whole world, and the kings of the east of Revelation 16, 12, and 14. And what is most important to understand here is that God's angels are keeping Satan's armies, or the kings of the earth and of the whole world, at bay, which are symbolized by the 4 winds, or 7 last plagues, till the sealing of God's people is accomplished. And as can be seen, these armies of Satan are the kings of the east and of the whole world. And this is further confirmed in this last statement by A.T. Jones, where I read, "There is no room for question that the collapse of the Ottoman power prepares the way for the kings of the East, which are the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to be gathered to the battle of Armageddon." And we can see how this connects, it ties directly to Revelation 16:12. That the kings of the East being prepared in verse 12 are the same ones being mentioned here. And I believe it is about as clear as can be now that the reason why Michael didn't stand up and probation didn't immediately close at the collapse of the Ottoman Empire is because the 4 angels who were holding back the winds as far back as 1849 continued holding them when the King of the North came to his end in 1922, resulting in the loss of his original territory of Syria to that of France with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. I think it is also made very clear, as A.T. Jones stated, that there is no room for question that the collapse of the Ottoman power prepares the way for the kings of the East. This statement is further confirmation that our pioneers believed it would be the collapse of the Ottoman power that prepares the way, and not that of the modern-day Republic of Turkey. This would have been impossible for them to be making the claim that it was Turkey because they had all passed away before the founding of the Republic of Turkey in 1923. They all died previously. So when they mention the King of the North, it's always synonymous with that of the Ottoman Empire. Turkish, Turkey, they are all referring to the Ottoman Empire. But I digress. We should all be very thankful and praising God for his long suffering and for his holding back these winds for as long as he has. And Lord willing, we will be a part of that number who will give the loud cry message and warn the world of Jesus' imminent return and the outpouring of these last plagues. Okay, we will now continue with the next portion of this study, where we will discuss the time of trouble. In the process of looking over the subject to address the question over how this period of trouble could possibly span more than 100 years, I came across this quote from 1848, which I had seen before but had forgotten about, and honestly it appeared to be a contradiction to me at first. The contradiction being that the time of trouble could have more than one starting point. But after prayerfully looking this over, I can now reconcile the first statement from 1848 with the quote on the following slide from 1904, where Sister White says that we are now entering the time of trouble. But first, let's unpack this statement. The time of trouble has commenced. It has begun. The reason why the four winds have not let go is because the saints are not all sealed. It's on the increase and will increase more and more. The trouble will never end until the earth is rid of the wicked. In the first part of this paragraph, we are reading the testimony of Sister White from a vision that she had, that the time of trouble had commenced and that it had begun. Keep in mind that this statement was made in 1848. And when Sister White says it's on the increase and will increase more and more, the trouble will never end until the earth is rid of the wicked, what Sister White is describing here is the scene that takes place after the 1,000 years at the judgment of the wicked. The trouble mentioned here extends through the 1,000 years. This is a confirmation of the following statement by Uriah Smith, where he says that the concluding troubles of the last days reach over to the destruction of the wicked at the end of the 1,000 years. And we can see this here is connected with the trouble in this statement by Sister White. And that this trouble is the same as the concluding troubles of Revelation 11:18. And that this is the same destruction of the wicked mentioned here by Uriah Smith as is mentioned here by Ellen White. As we progress in this study, we will see that this statement by Sister White is referring to the third woe, or seventh trumpet, and that it is in harmony with statements by J.N. Andrews, James White, Josiah Litch, Uriah Smith, and other pioneers, who describe the third woe lasting through the 1,000 years until the destruction of the wicked, and finally ending with when the earth is made new. What is being said here essentially is that the third woe, which, as we will see, began with the sounding of the seventh trumpet in 1844, that this woe is synonymous with the time of trouble before and after the close of probation. Two different periods of time, but one trouble. One where mercy still pleads for humanity, and the other where the door of mercy is shut. In the next half of this paragraph, we read, "At that time, neighbor will be against neighbor. At that time has not yet come, when brother against brother and sister against sister, but will come when Michael stands up. When Michael stands up, this trouble," once again, this is the part of the concluding troubles, "this trouble will be all over the earth." Okay, what Sister White is describing here is, in this vision, is a single time of trouble, which is clear when she says, "this trouble," referring to its beginning before Michael stands up in 1848 and increasing in intensity until Michael stands up. It then climaxes to the point where it will be brother against brother and sister against sister, and at which point this trouble will be all over the earth. That period of trouble we know as Jacob's time of trouble. What we see here is that this trouble lasts much longer than 100 years and only comes to an end after the 1,000 years, when the earth is rid of the wicked after the final judgment. Humanity is given a length of time before probation closes, a moment of respite as we have seen in the previous slides. That is what a merciful, long-suffering, and loving God has always done for his disobedient subjects when in the wilderness, and so too today. Now, there are many Adventists today who say that the third woe is still future, and that it begins when Islam at some point unites with Erdogan to take Jerusalem. And it is taught that this future event will be the signal that probation is about to close, and that all of this is to span just a few months at best. Now, which of these scenarios sounds like the working of a long-suffering and merciful God to you? A period where we're given a few months, or a period of a few generations? In the Rise and Fall of the King of the North study, I shared that the time of trouble began over 100 years ago, and my understanding wasn't wrong. I just didn't think that it had begun as far back as 1848. Now, taking this into consideration, along with the fact that the date of this and other statements regarding the time of trouble directly correspond with significant events intimately connected with the Eastern question, and with the third woe and the seventh trumpet, we will be able to better understand more clearly some of these more perplexing statements by Sister White. And in this last statement from Uriah Smith, written in 1877, we read, again, the 18th verse of Revelation shows us that this trumpet covers the concluding troubles of the last days and reaches over to the destruction of the wicked at the end of the 1,000 years. This is quite something. What we can see in the statement made by Sister White in 1848 here is a confirmation of Brother Smith's statement where he says that the seventh trumpet covers all the events of Revelation 11:18, which are the concluding troubles of the last days. And knowing the seventh trumpet began sounding in 1844, we can know that the concluding troubles also began at that time, as will be shown as we progress. This quote by Sister White is confirmation that the time of trouble or third woe begins with the sounding of the seventh trumpet, and that this woe covers the concluding troubles of the last days before probation closes, and the concluding troubles being those events of Revelation 11:18, the angry nations, the judgment of the dead, and the wrath of God. This sounding of the seventh trumpet, which marks the beginning of the third woe, we will cover in greater detail as we progress in this study. And FYI, this understanding that the time of trouble has an earlier starting date does not change anything that we have already covered in the Rise and Fall of the King of the North study. It only provides greater clarity and further evidence for the premise put forward by A.W. Anderson's This Mighty Hour article, that the time of trouble had already begun prior to 1935. This earlier starting point for the time of trouble also greatly increases the relevance of the events surrounding the Eastern question prior to World War I, especially when we see how these historical events directly correspond with the dates of Sister White's time of trouble statements. We are now in the time of trouble, where God's judgments are being poured out with mercy, and we have been for almost 180 years. But very, very soon, like the doors of the ark, the doors of mercy will be forever shut. We now continue with this next statement from 1894. I am writing this letter by lamplight, sitting upon my bed. I could not sleep longer than 2:30 a.m. The Lord lives and reigns. There is to be such a time of trouble as there never was since there was a nation. Already nations are angry. Already Satan is working with signs and lying wonders. And this will increase until the end. What we find here is that this quote resembles very closely the previous 1848 statement, where it is said that the time of trouble has commenced, it has begun. It is on the increase and will increase more and more. The trouble will never end until the earth is rid of the wicked, which we know occurs at the end of the 1,000 years with the judgment of the wicked. What she is saying here is essentially the same thing, that the trouble which began in 1848 was increasing. She then connects that trouble with the angry nations of Revelation 11:18. She further connects the angry nations with the signs and lying wonders of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 9. And as we can see, the events taking place in these different passages are all being used to describe the same scenes of escalating trouble, and that they are all synonymous with each other. This trouble being depicted here, as we will see in part 2 of this study, began when the cleansing of the sanctuary commenced in 1844. And from that time on, it continues to escalate, with the nations becoming more and more angry, and the deceptive signs and lying wonders also increasing until this trouble climaxes at the close of probation, where it will have at that point spread all over the earth. Now, take notice of the date of this first quote. We see that in 1894, they were anticipating a time of trouble such as never was. And then just 10 years later, we're told in this next statement from 1904 that they had then entered that time of trouble such as never was. And I read, "We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war." This is referring specifically to Revelation 16:13 and the three unclean spirits like frogs that go forth to the nations to gather the kings of the east and of the whole world to the battle of Armageddon. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment, referring to Daniel 11, verse 45. Much of the history that has taken place in fulfillment of this prophecy will be repeated. In the 30th verse, a power is spoken of that shall be grieved and return, and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Scenes similar to those described in these words will take place. We see evidence that Satan is fast obtaining the control of human minds who have not the fear of God before them. Let all read and understand the prophecies of this book, for we are now entering upon the time of trouble spoken of at that time. Again, we are now entering upon the time of trouble spoken of at that time. Shall Michael stand up? The great prince that standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. Okay, we just read that the whole world was being stirred with the spirit of war, where global conflict, the likes that the world had not seen before, were just on the horizon, and that soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place, referring to the trouble after Michael stands up, when the prophecies of the 11th of Daniel, specifically verse 45, have reached their complete fulfillment. Now, before going any further, I want to briefly touch on the history that is to be repeated in Daniel 11. It is the history of Daniel 11 verses 30 through 36 that is here specified to be repeated. Specifically mentioned, however, is verse 30, which is in reference to the history surrounding the Arian controversy, the Heruli, the Goths, and the Vandals with the Church of Rome over the personality of God. This controversy gave rise to the papacy, which led to the union of the church with the state, to enforce its creeds and traditions, and to persecute those who refused to accept human wisdom and authority in the place of the wisdom and authority of God. And this controversy is definitely being repeated today in our church. Moving on. Next, we will take a closer look at the last half of this quote. We find what at first had appeared to me to be a contradiction with the 1848 statement from the previous slide. How could the time of trouble have more than one starting point? How could it have commenced in 1848 and we then enter that same trouble again in 1904? This becomes clear, however, when we look at the time of trouble as consisting of phases or waymarks, marked by distinct escalation events, specifically wars. And when looking into the history of the events surrounding the Eastern Question in 1848, and further researching the events of 1894, 1904, as well as significant events surrounding 1907, we will find that Sister White's statements referring to the time of trouble were written within a very short time frame of these various escalation events directly connected with the Eastern Question, which further increased the trouble and anger of the nations. In 1904, we find the preliminary phase of war that led to the final dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in 1923, that being the Russo-Japanese War, which we will look at more closely as we continue in this study. Now, the most important part of this statement to take into consideration is where Sister White tells us, the prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment. She then states in the same quote that we are now entering upon the time of trouble spoken of at that time, referring to Daniel 12:1. But how can that be when it was just stated that the prophecy of the 11th of Daniel had not reached its complete fulfillment yet? Again, I ask, how is it possible that they could have entered the time of trouble of Daniel 12:1 before Daniel 11:45 had been fulfilled? To answer this, we must keep in mind what I refer to as the retroactive principle, where a prophecy announces the climax or final event first, and then retroactively reaches backward in time to summarize, explain, or illuminate earlier developments that were already underway before the climax occurred. Simply put, it is a form of prophetic preconfiguration, the arrangement in advance or early alignment of events, powers, and conditions that are necessary for the final fulfillment of the prophecy when its appointed time arrives. This principle is brought out in Daniel and the Revelation, page 649, paragraph 2, with the three unclean spirits like frogs of Revelation 16:13. These spirits are only mentioned at the outpouring of the sixth plague, but their work is retroactive in that they go forth to gather the nations before the close of probation, before any of the plagues are poured out. This principle functions as a means of preparing the actors, the kings of the East and of the whole world, for the part that they will play leading up to and after the close of probation. This same principle holds true with Daniel 12:1, which is describing the same scene, with the phrase "at that time" being a process in time, the time needed to prepare the way for the kings of the East. This is the same principle Sister White is depicting here, and even references the three unclean spirits of the sixth plague, which were already stirring the world to battle before the complete fulfillment of Daniel 11, and before Michael stands up. What is clearly presented in this 1904 statement is that the trouble of Daniel 12:1 had already begun before the fulfillment of Daniel 11:45. Put simply, this trouble began before the close of probation, but does not end until it reaches a climax after the close of probation. A good analogy for this retroactive principle is to imagine Mount Vesuvius before it erupted as the pre-close of probation time of trouble, with the shaking, the tremors, and the smoke. The trouble that the people were witnessing were warning signs of the greater trouble to come. These warning signs allowed the people to seek shelter before the explosive eruption and pyroclastic flows that destroyed everything in the surrounding area. This climax of trouble where Vesuvius finally erupted represents the post-close of probation, or Jacob's time of trouble, a very short period which comes about suddenly and unexpectedly for those who were not watching and would not heed the warning signs given. Okay, we will now be getting into the heart of this study, where we will explore the significance of the years 1848, 1894, 1904, 1907, and other significant dates. But firstly, we'll examine the year 1848, where Sister White stated, "The time of trouble has commenced, it has begun." Now, we will start here with this Wikipedia page, and we see that the revolutions of 1848, they were known as part of the age of revolution. And they began in January and ran through October of 1849, January 1848 to October 1849. The location was Western and Northern and Central Europe, also known as the Springtime of Nations, the Springtime of Peoples, the Year of Revolutions. And the participant countries included France, the German Coalition or Confederation, Hungary, Italian states, Denmark, Ireland, Moldavia, Wallachia, Poland, and others. Now, the revolutions of 1848, known in some countries as the Springtime of the Peoples or Springtime of Nations, were a series of revolutions throughout Europe over the course of more than 1 year, from 1848 to 1849. It remains the most widespread revolutionary wave in European history to date. The revolutions were essentially democratic and liberal in nature, with the aim of removing the old monarchical structures and creating independent nation-states, as envisioned by Romantic nationalism. The revolution spread across Europe after an initial revolution began in Italy in January of 1848. Over 50 countries were affected, but with no significant coordination or cooperation among their respective revolutionaries. And skipping down here, you can pause it and read the rest on your own, but to save time, we'll skip down. The uprisings were led by temporary coalitions of workers and reformers, including figures from the middle and upper classes, the bourgeois. However, the coalitions did not hold together for long. Many of the revolutions were quickly suppressed, as tens of thousands of people were killed, and even more were forced into exile. And skipping down here, the revolutions were the most important in France, the Netherlands, Italy, the Austrian Empire, and the states of the German Confederation that would make up the German Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The wave of uprisings ended in October of 1849. Now, what is remarkable is that this date marked the most widespread revolutionary wave in European history. And we will see that these revolutions directly influenced the Eastern question and by extension further angered the nations. On this next slide, we have some very important history on the Risorgimento or Italian War of Independence, which was part of the revolutions of 1848, and its effects on the papacy, which led to two events, one on November 15th, just prior to Sister White's November 19th, 1848 statement about the time of trouble commencing, and one just after it on November 24th. This second event is very significant in that it sparked the Roman question, which we will look at in further detail on the next slide. And reading from this article, Pope Pius IX escapes from the Quirinal, November 24th, 1848. Pope Pius IX's refusal to declare war on Austria had turned the liberals of Rome utterly against him. They now sought his downfall. Secret societies in the city stirred up the common people to demand nothing less than a secular constitutional government for the papal states. And the more the Pope tried to appease the liberals, the more they demanded of him. Even the Pope's chief ministers, led by a layman, Count Mamiani, demanded that the Pope not only declare war on Austria, but also abandon his temporal power altogether. On November 15th, 1848, Rossi, or Count Pellegrino Rossi, was Pope Pius IX's chief minister, effectively the prime minister of the Papal States, during the turbulent months leading up to the 1848 revolutions. Rossi was to attend a meeting of Rome's Legislative Assembly to present his plan for a new constitutional order. After being warned that if he attended the meeting, an attempt would be made on his life, he replied, "I defend the cause of the Pope, and the cause of the Pope is the cause of God. I must and will go." That day, November 15th, as he entered the assembly hall, someone struck him with a cane. Turning toward his attacker, Rossi was set upon by another assailant, who drove a dagger into his neck. Though members of the civic guard were in the courtyard, no one attempted to arrest the Count's killer. Pope Pius knew that if he remained in Rome, he would simply become a pawn of the revolutionaries who controlled the city. On the evening of November 24th, 1848, a well-laid plan was put into effect. With the aid of the French minister, the Bavarian ambassador, and his own personal attendant, Pius escaped from the Quirinal, disguised as a common priest. At last, he passed through the gates of Rome and entered a carriage that was to take him to Gaeta, where the king of the two Sicilies had promised him a refuge. Now, these two events, on November 15th and November 24th, these two events led to the very temporary Roman Republic, which began in 1849 and ended in 1850. The Roman Republic, or Republica Romana, was a short-lived state declared on the 9th of February 1849, when the government of the Papal States was temporarily replaced by a republican government due to Pope Pius IX's departure to Gaeta. During this time, Rome was without a local government for the first time in recent history. But by 1849, and with the help of the French Napolitan army, Pope Pius IX was able to return to Rome in 1850 and regain control of the Holy See. Interesting how it is that France always seems to be the one protecting and providing life support for the Vatican, or a proxy. What is also very interesting is the fact that they were also sustaining the Ottoman Empire during the Crimean War. France was also known to be protecting Catholics in the Ottoman Empire and intervened militarily in Ottoman Syria in 1860 to protect Christians, especially the Maronites, from local violence, obtaining permission from the Ottoman government to even send in troops. And here we have a statement from early writings, which was made on December 16th of 1848. In it, reference is made to the European revolutions, which took place that same year. And I read, "Dark heavy clouds came up and clashed against each other. The atmosphere parted and rolled back. Then we could look up through the open space in Orion, from whence came the voice of God. The holy city will come down through that open space. I saw that the powers of earth are now being shaken, and that events come in order. War and rumors of war, sword, famine, and pestilence are first to shake the powers of earth. Then the voice of God will shake the sun, moon, and stars, and this earth also. I saw that the shaking of the powers in Europe is not, as some teach, the shaking of the powers of heaven, but it is the shaking of the angry nations." This statement identifies a very significant historical waymarker, that being the commencement of the angry nations of Revelation 11:18, one which calls our attention to the role that these revolutions played in the development of end-time events. The revolutions of 1848 in particular were crucial in that they allowed for the formation of Zionism, which ultimately led to the establishment of the modern state of Israel 100 years later in 1948. Satan and his deceived followers are planning to make this modern state of Israel the capital of the world and the headquarters of their new world order and religion, where Satan himself will attempt to personate Christ and claim that he is the rightful ruler and God of this world. This modern state of Israel is a counterfeit to the New Jerusalem, which, after the 1,000 years, will be the capital of the universe where God the Father and his Son will reign. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into this history connecting the 1848 revolutions with the establishment of Israel today, but I am working on a future study where I hope to explore this history in greater detail. And before moving on, I just want to point out the verse that Sister White is referencing here, that being Haggai 2, verse 6. "For thus saith the Lord of hosts, yet once it is a little while, and I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land." This verse is in reference to the first and second advent of Christ, and is an example of how a phrase such as "a little while," when used in Scripture, can span a great length of time. And in this case, that would be 500 years to the time of Christ and just over 2,500 years to our time, and reminds us of just how short the period of time is in which our lives occupy. And even if we are fortunate enough to live for 100 years, that is still just a vapor in comparison. And reading this last statement here. "The present is a solemn, fearful time for the Church. The angels are already girded, awaiting the mandate of God to pour their vials of wrath upon the world. The destroying angels are taking up the work of vengeance, for the Spirit of God is gradually withdrawing from the world. Satan is also mustering his forces of evil, going forth unto the kings of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them under his banner, to be trained for the battle of that great day of God Almighty. Something I want to point out here is that the training here mentioned is not only the training for the Battle of Armageddon at Jesus' second advent, but also for the continuation of that same battle after the 1,000 years, when Satan will make one last desperate attempt to take New Jerusalem with the resurrected wicked, after it settles in the great plain which is made by Jesus after he sets foot on the Mount of Olives. Also, there are only two banners we may choose to stand under, either the banner of Christ by accepting his righteousness, as is represented by our keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, or by honoring the spurious Sunday Sabbath, and the banner of Satan, representing rebellion against God's law and his authority, and the acceptance of the authority of men in its place. Now, there are many today that are living up to the light that God has given them on this subject, and God winks at our ignorance and judges according to the light that we have received. It is only when we acknowledge the truth and continue to reject it that we become accountable and judged accordingly. What all of this is about in the end is more than just today. It is ultimately a test of over who we will worship, and will very soon become the test for all those dwelling on the earth. And when the last decision is made, and the Gentile nations of the world, when their cup of iniquity is finally full, which Luke 21:24 refers to as the fullness of the Gentiles, then Michael will stand up, and only then will the end come. Okay, here we have a Roman Catholic site called The Collector, where it goes into a little more detail on the Roman question. The Roman question, the Pope versus the new nation of Italy. During the Risorgimento, or the Italian War of Independence, Pope Pius IX refused to accept the annexation of the Papal States to the new Kingdom of Italy. The result was a years-long stalemate, the Roman question. Keep in mind, that began in 1848. On September 20th, 1870, when Italian troops entered Rome through a breach in the city's wall at Porta Pia, Pope Pius IX refused to accept the new status quo, declaring himself a prisoner of the Vatican. He would never set foot outside the palace again. Pius IX's steadfast unwillingness to recognize the new kingdom of Italy resulted in the so-called Roman question, a long dispute between the papacy and the Italian state. The stalemate ended in 1929 when Benito Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty, a bilateral agreement recognizing the Pope's sovereignty over the new state of Vatican City. Now keep in mind, Vatican City did not exist prior to 1929. That's not very well known, but it came about after 1929. Now, reading on, the Lateran Treaty resolved the Roman question in 1929. The Holy See acknowledged Italian sovereignty over the Papal States, and Italy recognized Papal sovereignty over Vatican City. The Holy See limited its request for indemnity for the loss of the Papal States and of ecclesiastical property confiscated by the Italian state to much less than would have been due to it under the law of guarantees. Now, as we saw from the previous slide, the Year of Revolutions in 1848 is what led to the Roman question, which was later resolved through the Lateran Treaty. The events surrounding the Roman question are very significant, and I refuse to believe it is just happenstance that this event coincides precisely with Sister White's statement in 1848 that the time of trouble had commenced. And we shall see as we move on that this is not just an isolated incident. And just for FYI, I will be getting into this subject in more detail in a future study. There's just not enough time to go into as much detail as I would like in this study. But moving on. Here we have a very interesting cartoon from 1860, where is portrayed two sick men of Europe, being sustained by that of France, who is represented here by Napoleon III, who was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. We have him in the center, and then Pope Pius IX on the left, and to the right here we have the Turkish Sultan Abdul Majid I. And something that was mentioned previously is that France was and is the proxy of Rome, and provided life support to Pope Pius IX and to the Turkish Sultan Abdul Majid. Interestingly, we find at this moment in history the Eastern question and the Roman question to be contemporary with one another, or they overlap one another, and that there were actually two sick men of Europe during this time period. And reading this caption here, the Pope, "They have sent you my French doctor, I see. His course of steel hasn't done my system much good." Now, what is meant by this course of steel not doing the Pope's system much good? It is this. The French doctor refers to, again, Emperor Napoleon III, shown here in the middle, administering gruel, or medicine, to these two sick men. This course of steel alludes to military intervention, literally the steel of swords, guns, and bayonets. Napoleon III had sent French troops into both the Papal States and the Ottoman Empire in the 1850s through the 1860s under the guise of curing or stabilizing them. Something else to note here, we'll read quickly. The state of Turkey, this is a reference to the Ottoman Empire. The state of Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, being very unsatisfactory, the people demanding financial and other reforms, the Emperor Napoleon was said to be offering advice to the sick man. Now, I just wanted to emphasize that when they say the state of Turkey, it is not a reference to the Republic of Turkey, but to the Ottoman Empire. Anytime that's mentioned prior to 1923, Turkey, they're referring to the Ottoman Empire. But I digress. Now, again, and as was stated previously, there isn't enough time to get into the details of this history today, although I'd like to. But God willing, we will explore this and the role that the papacy played in the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in a future study. But to put it simply, one of these sick men had to be put out of his misery, or had to come to his end, in order that the other sick man might be healed. The Treaty of Lausanne, which resolved the Eastern question in 1923, this also opened the door for the Lateran Treaty, which resolved the Roman question just 6 years later in 1929, which resulted in the papacy's deadly wound being healed. Okay, continuing on with the study. Here we have an excerpt from the book The History of the Ottoman Empire and Modern Turkey by Stanford J. Shaw. And in this book, we find the significance of this year of revolutions that took place in 1848 and its intimate link with the Eastern question. And as we can see here, the origins of the Crimean War were the revolutions of 1848. And what we can also see is a trend. As Ellen White said in 1848, that the time of trouble will increase more and more. So what we have here are the revolutions, which then increases, and the tensions increase, the trouble increases, and then we have the Crimean War as a result. Now, I'm just going to read the highlighted portions here. You can pause and read the rest. The Crimean War was basically a conflict between Russia on one side and Britain and France on the other, to see who would dominate the Middle East politically and economically as the Ottoman Empire declined. Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, on the other hand, was convinced that the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. He actually coined that phrase, by the way. That it was bound to collapse, and wished only to make sure that Russia would be in a good position to take more than its share of the spoils. The revolutions of 1848, however, upset the concord between Britain and Russia. The events that affected the Eastern question in particular started in Budapest, where the Chamber of Deputies declared Hungary virtually independent of the Habsburg Empire. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of this. You can pause it and read it on your own. But the Crimean War demonstrated that the Ottomans were militarily weak, and could not survive without European support. But paradoxically, instead of being partitioned, they were preserved, because Britain and France did not want Russia to gain Ottoman territory. This confirmed the Ottoman Empire's role as the sick man of Europe, kept alive artificially by outside powers. So we can see that this event actually confirmed the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe. Very significant. The Crimean War revealed the decrepitude of the Ottoman Empire militarily. It could not defend itself against Russia and only survived because Britain and France chose to intervene on its behalf. Now, as we have seen, the year 1848 was a major mile marker as far as historical events involving the Eastern Question were concerned. And the revolutions that took place then led directly to the Crimean War, which further increased the trouble or anger among those nations involved with the Eastern Question. Okay, here we have another article on the causes of the Crimean War from the historicuk.com. And we read, many British towns and cities have streets named after battles fought during the Crimean War, such as Alma, Sebastopol, Balaklava, and Inkerman. But who fought this war and why? The Crimean War broke out on the 5th of October 1853, a military conflict fought between the Russian Empire on one side against an alliance of Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia. The complexity of the war meant that it was fought on the grounds of various reasons by different parties, as everyone had a vested interest in the region. The outbreak of violence arose from various factors, including the issue of Christian minority rights in the Holy Land, the overall declining Ottoman Empire leading to the Eastern Question, and a resistance from the British and French to Russian expansion. With so many factors at play, the Crimean War proved inevitable. What I want to emphasize here, though, is that this, right here, the Christian minority rights in the Holy Land, this was at the core of the tensions. It was who would control Palestine and Jerusalem, or the Holy Sepulchres. But moving on. In the years leading up to Crimea, competition between nations was rife, the prize being control of the Middle East, which was enough to ignite national rivalry between France, Russia, and Britain. The outbreak of the Crimean War was a culmination of longer-term international issues together with immediate conflicts over Christian minorities in the Holy Land. Now, when they say it was over the minorities in the Holy Land, it was really over the Holy Land, not the minorities. But I digress. For several years, the power exercised by the declining Ottoman Empire provided an opportunity for other nations to expand their power base. In the end, the desire for power, fear of competition, and conflict over religion proved too difficult to resolve. Now, what we find here is that the Crimean War was a significant event in the context of the Eastern Question. This war paved the way for World War I by reshaping the European balance of power and accelerating the unresolved Eastern Question. The Ottoman government had always been hesitant to take on foreign loans. However, during the hostilities of 1854, the need for funds was so high that the empire relented and entered into loan agreements with its European allies. Between 1854 and 1874, the Ottoman Empire struck 15 loan agreements with foreign powers. The loans were taken with the aim of restructuring the empire's dysfunctional bureaucracy, centralizing revenues and expenditures, and modernizing the army. The Crimean War ultimately led to the complete dependency on foreign banks. Now, we could spend much time on the history surrounding the Year of Revolutions and the Crimean War and its connection with the Eastern Question, but for lack of time, I suggest those who are watching to look up this history. It is fascinating. We now come to the year 1894, and when we dive into the history surrounding the Eastern Question in 1894, we find that there were multiple significant events connected with it, which align perfectly with this statement by Sister White mentioned previously. I am writing this letter by lamplight, sitting upon my bed. I could not sleep longer than than 2:30 a.m. The Lord lives and reigns. There is to be such a time of trouble as there never was since there was a nation. Already nations are angry. Already Satan is working with signs and lying wonders. And this will increase until the end. What we find here in 1894 is a representation of these angry nations. First, we have the Franco-Russian alliance of the 4th of January, 1894, and this cemented the division of Europe into blocs, which then led to World War I. This was a very significant event in regard to the Eastern question. This then led to the Sino-Japanese War, which broke out on the 24th of July, 1894. This later led to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. We then have the Sassoon Massacre of August of 1894, where Armenians were slaughtered in the Ottoman Empire. This was the beginning of the Hamidian massacres. This massacre put the Armenian question at the center of the Eastern question once again, transforming what had been a regional atrocity into a geopolitical issue. And we read here a little bit more on this massacre. The large-scale and widespread massacres of the Armenian subjects of the Ottoman Empire from Sassoon in August 1894 to Tokat in February and March of 1897 caused a sensation in Europe and North America. They gave rise to a flood of publications detailing numerous atrocities and expressing moral outrage. And a little more here. The massacre began after the middle of August, about the 18th of August. And we can see here that that was within just 2 weeks of this statement by Sister White. And this continued to about the 10th of September. The safe estimates put the number of victims at about 4,000, not less than 3,500, and in all probability more than 4,000. Men, women, and children were most barbarously slaughtered. Unnameable outrages were perpetrated on all. It's very sad. Now, although the Sassoon massacre did not directly lead to the Armenian genocide, it was the starting point of a pattern of state-sponsored massacres that escalated into genocide two decades later. It showed both Ottoman rulers and Armenian communities that mass violence could be carried out with little consequence, paving the road to the Armenian genocide of 1915. And as we have seen in the rise and fall of the King of the North study, the three pashas, which made up the Young Turk triumvirate, were all assassinated in Operation Nemesis for the role they played in the Armenian genocide. All of these events occurred within a short time of the 1894 statement by Sister White, as can be seen. They are all connected and are an expression of the anger of the nations that was steadily escalating as time progressed, which we will see as we move on in this study. We now fast forward 10 years to the year 1904, where it was stated, "We have no time to lose. Troublous times are before us. The world is stirred with the spirit of war. Soon the scenes of trouble spoken of in the prophecies will take place. The prophecy in the 11th of Daniel has nearly reached its complete fulfillment," referring again to Daniel 11:45. "Let all read and understand the prophecies of this book, for we are now entering upon the time of trouble spoken of. At that time shall Michael stand up," referring to Daniel 12:1. What I need to point out here once more is that Sister White was declaring here in 1904 that they were then entering the time of trouble of Daniel 12:1, before the complete fulfillment of Daniel 11, specifically verse 45. Now, this is not my opinion, and I am only stating the obvious here, but I digress. Okay, we will now examine the significance of the events surrounding 1904, beginning with this article from History.com on the Russo-Japanese War, titled World War Zero. Russia was already a significant world power in the early 20th century, with vast territories in Eastern Europe and Central Asia under its control, and Japan was widely viewed as the dominant force in Asia at the time. Therefore, the war garnered significant global attention, and its ramifications were felt long after the final shot was fired in 1905. In fact, scholars have suggested that the Russo-Japanese War set the stage for World War I and ultimately World War II, as some of the central issues in the first conflict were at the core of the fighting during the latter two. Some have even referred to it as World War Zero, given that it took place less than a decade before the start of World War I. Regarding the Eastern question, the Russo-Japanese War was a very significant event. It effectively removed Russia from the Eastern question and left France and Britain in the dominant positions to take the spoils of the Ottoman territories after its collapse. And as we can see, this war was believed to be the war that set the stage for World War I and World War II. Again, very significant. And notice here as well, the date of this statement by Sister White. This was made on the 24th of February, 1904, just 16 days after the outbreak of this war on the 8th of February of 1904. I do not believe this to be a coincidence, and when we look at this history more closely, it becomes clear that 1904 was a turning point where the entire world was being stirred with the spirit of war. We will now go over a little bit of the history behind the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and the Treaty of Portsmouth that followed in 1905. The Treaty of Portsmouth formally ended the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 5. The negotiations took place in August in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and were brokered in part by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt. Now, it was a very significant thing in that time period that a U.S. president would get involved with making peace negotiations between two foreign countries. And this shift in domestic policy signals the beginning of America's entrance onto the scene of global politics, especially having to do with the Eastern question. By 1904, Russia and Japan had endured several years of disputes over control of Manchuria. The Russians had entered the region during the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 5, and along with Germany and France was a part of the Triple Intervention that forced Japan to give up its demands for ports in South Manchuria and the Liaodong Peninsula in the wake of its victory in China. Instead, Russia moved into the area and took control of Port Arthur, a warm water port with strategic and commercial significance. A Japanese attempt to stage a coup in adjacent Korea was thwarted in part by the Russian presence in the region, and the two nations' divergent interests appeared more and more likely to clash. In 1904, the Japanese attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur before the formal declaration of war was received in Moscow, surprising the Russian Navy and earning an early victory. Over the course of the next year, the two forces clashed in Korea and the Sea of Japan, with the Japanese scoring significant but costly victories. As we read here, we see that the Russian advances into Japanese territories what initially led to the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, and that the territorial disputes involved spanned a decade. And again, we see the pivotal dates here being that of 1894 and 1904. This war also resulted in the collapse of Russian prestige. The defeat of Tsarist Russia by an Asian power was an international shock. Russia's humiliation at Port Arthur shattered its credibility as a European great power. Domestically, the war triggered the 1905 Russian Revolution as well, forcing Nicholas II to create the Duma and rely more heavily on reactionary alliances to stay afloat. To rebuild, Russia turned westward, deepening its dependence on France for loans and Britain for diplomatic rehabilitation. This shift directly produced the Triple Entente of 1907, the anti-German coalition that later faced the Central Powers in World War I. Okay, what I want to focus on in this slide is this last statement here. You can pause and read the rest. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt became the first American to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his masterful intervention in the Russo-Japanese War. America had arrived. From that time until now, no nation has ever successfully failed to understand America's enormous global power. So prior to this, they were not recognized as an enormous global power. By mediating the peace treaty of Portsmouth of 1905, Theodore Roosevelt proved that the U.S. could reshape world affairs without firing a shot. This war also led to Washington gaining international prestige and permanent diplomatic leverage. The U.S. Navy drew tactical lessons from Japan's victory, accelerating modernization under Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, which launched, coincidentally, in 1907. That global demonstration cruise announced America was now a two-ocean power, able to project influence in both the Atlantic and the Pacific, a key precondition for later participation in a European war related to the Eastern Question. And for lack of time, I can't cover every detail of the history that led up to America's being recognized as a world power. But briefly, the United States first began its ascent to world power status in 1898 with the outcome of the Spanish-American War and its territorial gains in the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. But its decisive diplomatic role in the Russo-Japanese War, culminating in the Treaty of Portsmouth, solidified its standing as a global power in the eyes of Europe and Asia. All right, we have already covered some of this history, so I'm going to start right here. The Japanese had shocked the world in its stunning victories, taking Port Arthur with little loss of life, occupying the southern half of the contested island of Sakhalin, annihilating Russia's Baltic fleet that had traveled all the way around the world to take on the Japanese Navy. Meanwhile, Japan's treasury was exhausted, but it was stubbornly vowing to continue the war to achieve all of its territorial aims. Now, something else that is very significant about the Russo-Japanese War is the financial reordering that took place as a result of this war. The US and British financial sectors, through houses like Jacob Schiff's, Kuhn, Loeb & Co., funneled capital to Japan, marking the start of Wall Street's role in global war finance, thus marking another outcome of this war that is of great significance. After the war, New York displaced Paris as the main international lender, and by 1914, America was the world's principal creditor. This financial ascendancy allowed the U.S. to bankroll the Entente later in World War I, without direct early involvement, until 1917, when economic exposure and maritime attacks forced entry. And reading this last statement, President Roosevelt's diplomatic intervention was effectively the moment when the United States announced to the world that it was ready to join the handful of first-tier nations, even in the ancient art of diplomacy. It was, in effect, the birth of the American century. Okay, from the information provided here, we find more historical evidence that the Russo-Japanese War marked the United States' recognition as a global power. And from 1904 onward, we find that the tensions and escalations among the world's powers increased dramatically. Here we have a little background on Jacob Schiff. And for sake of time, I'm not going to read through this sketch, but you can pause and read it for yourself. I will, however, give a general overview. Jacob Schiff essentially bankrolled the Japanese war effort, resulting in their victory over Russia, which then led to the Russian Revolution of 1905, which erupted in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. This was the direct precursor to and rehearsal for the 1917 Russian Revolution, which led to the downfall of Tsarist Russia in 1917. The two events were separated by 12 years, but they were connected in every essential way, politically, socially, and psychologically. Also, I believe it is of significance that Jacob Schiff's father, Moses Schiff, was one of the Rothschild's brokers, Rothschild being the main benefactor of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which led to the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948. If we are paying attention at all here, we begin to see a pattern emerge to these conflicts and the work going on behind the scenes, a pattern that has been developing over a long period of time, a pattern of war, revolving around the procurement of Palestine for the establishment and return of the Jews of the flesh to a counterfeit New Jerusalem. We will now explore the significance of the events surrounding the year 1907, events that would lead directly into World War I. But first, I will read this statement. We are nearing the close of 1907. We are standing upon the threshold of great and solemn events. Prophecies are fulfilling. Everything in our world is in agitation. There are wars and rumors of wars. The nations are angry, and the time of the dead has come, that they should be judged. Events are changing to bring about the day of God, which hasteth greatly. Only a moment of time, as it were, yet remains. But while already nation is rising against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, there is not now a general engagement. As yet the four winds are held until the servants of God shall be sealed in their foreheads. Then the powers of earth will marshal their forces for the last great battle. Now, Sister White herself attaches special significance to the year 1907 here, and lists, as Uriah Smith put it, the concluding troubles of the last days, referring to the prophecies of Revelation 11:18 and Matthew 24:6 and 7, and that they were then fulfilling, and that only a moment of time yet remains before a general engagement and last great battle. She then mentions the four winds again, and their being held back during this little moment of time yet remaining. This moment of time is the time necessary for the three unclean spirits to prepare the actors for the part that they will play in the final act and last great battle of Armageddon. Notice as well that of the three events of Revelation 11:18 listed, only one was seen as yet future, that being the day of God, which hasteth greatly. In this quote, Sister White lays out another example of the retroactive principle or preconfiguration of conditions that would make the final crisis possible. The conditions that were forming then in 1907 were shifting the world into the position where the final crisis can break out once probation has closed and the four winds finally released. Here we have the Triple Entente, or alliance, which, as we can see here by the highlighted dates, that this alliance of nations took place over a period of 13 years. And if you haven't already noticed, the events that led up to this alliance took place on 3 of the 4 dates that we have covered so far. Those dates being 1894, 1904, and 1907. Now, I came across this information after the fact and was very surprised to find that all 3 of these dates were listed together like this. And this is just another evidence that these world-changing events are directly connected with the Spirit of Prophecy statements that we have covered so far. And now I will read this brief description from Britannica.com. The Triple Entente was the association between Great Britain, France, and Russia, the nucleus of the Allied powers in World War I. It developed from the Franco-Russian alliance that gradually developed and was formalized in 1894, the Anglo-French Entente Cordiale of 1904, and an Anglo-Russian agreement of 1907, which brought the Triple Entente into existence. And now I will read this little bit from one more source. The Triple Entente was the alliance formed between Great Britain, France, and Russia in the early 20th century. The Triple Entente was the key counterweight to Germany's Triple Alliance, that being Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. It wasn't a single treaty, but a series of bilateral agreements. Together, these created a loose alignment, not a formal military alliance, but enough to present a united diplomatic and strategic front. The bottom line is this. The Triple Entente was, in large part, a coordinated response to the Eastern question, specifically to Russian and German ambitions in the collapsing Ottoman Empire. And without this alliance, the nucleus of the Allied powers of World War I would never have formed. Here we have an article that also connects the Triple Entente of 1907 with World War I. And I read, in the early years of the 20th century, Europe was a continent on the brink of war. The rapid rise of Germany as a military and industrial power had upset the delicate balance of power that had existed since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and the major European nations were scrambling to form alliances and secure their positions in the face of this new threat. It was in this context that Britain, France, and Russia came together to form the Triple Entente in 1907. This loose alliance, based on a series of bilateral agreements and understandings, would ultimately prove to be one of the most significant diplomatic developments of the pre-war era, setting the stage for the outbreak of World War I and reshaping the course of European history. Now, as we have seen, the Triple Entente was a pivotal event, an event resulting with the alliances that ultimately led to World War I in 1914. All right, here we have an article on the Young Turks and the role that they played in the events surrounding 1907. And for reference, I have Sister White's 1907 quote here on the screen, but to save time, I won't go through it again. Now, continuing here with the article. The Young Turks is the term generally applied to the opposition to the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II's rule. Although the foundations of the movement can be traced back to 1889, it only became politically active prior to the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. Its members at the time forced the reinstatement of the constitution and the parliament after 30 years of autocracy. Between 1908 and 1918, it was the Young Turks who governed the Ottoman Empire. And skipping down here to this next paragraph. In 1906, some military officers and government officials formed another group called the Ottoman Freedom Society in Salonika. They joined the CUP in 1907, and because of their reputation for action, these men became the ruling faction. From then on, the new coalition was named the Committee for Union and Progress, or CUP. In the same year of 1907, between the 27th and 29th of December, the Second Congress of Ottoman Liberals met in Paris and resolved to topple Abdul Hamid II from power. Meanwhile, domestic opposition and conspiracy against the Hamidian regime regrouped in Macedonia. Different oppositional groups coalesced to revitalize the CUP, which in 1907 contacted the Ahmet Riza Group in Europe. However, the exile communities had no role in the immediate circumstances that led to the Young Turk Revolution. Now pay special attention here. If international events like the Japanese victory over Russia, referring to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, and the Russian and Iranian revolutions, referring to the Russian Revolution of 1905, energized Young Turks everywhere, the nationalist activity among the Balkan peoples and the perceived threat to the empire by enhanced relations between Britain and Russia, referring to the Anglo-Russian Agreement of 1907, which led to the Triple Entente, impelled the Unionists in Salonika and Monastir to action. Okay, there's something here that I want to call your attention to first, and that is the formation of the Young Turk CUP in 1907, and they're leading the coup the following year in 1908. What is significant about this is the fact that the formation of the Young Turk CUP and the plot to overthrow the Sultan occurred just a little over a month after Sister White's November 24th statement here in 1907. Now, is this another coincidence, or do we see a pattern emerging? I think it becomes obvious when we look at what was just mentioned at the end of this article, where we see how the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, the Russian Revolution of 1905, and the Triple Entente of 1907 all helped to energize the Young Turk movement and strengthened the CUP. This new surge of confidence and momentum helped spark the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which overthrew Abdul Hamid II's autocratic pan-Islamic regime and redirected the Ottoman Empire toward constitutionalism, nationalism, and modern state reforms. The CUP's rise was set in motion by the ripple effects of the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and became one of the decisive forces that accelerated the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This collapse ultimately allowed the Eastern Question to be fully resolved with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. And it also created the political and institutional conditions that later enabled Mustafa Kemal Ataturk to establish the fully secular Republic of Turkey between 1923 and 1938. Okay. Now, I would say that this last connection with the Russo-Japanese War and the Russian Revolution and the Triple Entente could be just a coincidence. But after coming across so many coincidences, we begin to see a pattern emerge here. Now, before moving on to the next event, I just want to mention that I am working on a future study where we will explore the influence that Rome had in the formation of the Young Turks, as well as the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which followed. We will now go over a little of the history of Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, which many of you, like myself, were probably not too familiar with this history before now. The sailing of this fleet around the globe in 1907 was very significant in that it was the proof that the United States had become a global power. And I read, Roosevelt stressed upgrading and expanding the U.S. fleet in order to protect American interests abroad. From 1904 to 1907, very interesting dates here, American shipyards turned out 11 new battleships to give the Navy awesome capabilities. This proved timely, for in 1907, hostilities with Japan seemed possible. The Japanese Navy dominated the Pacific and posed a potential threat to the Philippines. America's problems with Japan arose shortly after Roosevelt mediated the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1906, ending the Russo-Japanese War. In that conflict, the Russian fleet had been annihilated by the Japanese. But despite their triumphs over the Russians on the high seas, the Japanese failed to get all that they believed they deserved at the peace table, and blamed Roosevelt. Roosevelt did not want to break with Japan, as the United States was ill-prepared for war. Most of our battle fleet was concentrated in the Atlantic, with only a handful of armored cruisers in the Pacific. In the event of war with Japan, this small Asiatic squadron would have to abandon the Philippines for West Coast ports until the United States had strength enough to go on the offensive. Thus, to reassure residents of the West Coast that the U.S. Navy could protect them, Roosevelt ordered the Atlantic battleship fleet to shift to the Pacific. Now, these next two statements here are especially significant. The world cruise was a diplomatic triumph. Besides proving that the United States could project its power globally, the tour improved relations with many countries, in particular Australia and Japan. The cruise of the Great White Fleet had many substantial results for national esteem, for diplomacy, and for Navy technology. The cruise proved that the United States was a world power, capable of projecting its influence. Now, as we have seen so far, the year 1907 was a pivotal year, not only with the formation of the Triple Entente, but also with the formation of the Young Turks CUP, which in 1907 conspired to overthrow Sultan Abdul Hamid II's government. We then have the formation of Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet in 1907. And again, I do not believe that these events, especially the latter two, which took place near the close of 1907, are coincidences. Okay, we're about to wrap up part 1 of this study, but I had to add just one more slide for good measure. This was taken from Wikipedia, and I won't spend the time reading this as we have covered most of this history already. But I wanted to share with you another very significant event that took place, with the launching of Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, which occurred on the 16th of December, 1907. What we have here is yet another event that took place within a very short window of just 3 weeks of the writing of this statement by Sister White on November 24th, 1907. Of the specific dates concerning the events surrounding the Eastern Question, and their lining up so closely with the statements covered so far, I believe it is fair to conclude that we are dealing with something that is beyond the realm of coincidence. What we have observed so far is historical evidence of the escalating troubles referenced by Sister White in 1848, troubles that have direct causal links with the troubles we are witnessing in our world today. And I don't think anyone would argue that this trouble is increasing exponentially and will only increase more and more. But as Jesus reminds us in Matthew 24, verse 6, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Only in Jesus can we have peace through this storm of trouble on the horizon." Okay, the next two slides will help to visualize the order of events that we have covered so far in this study. These events can be looked at as waymarkers of trouble, or signs of the times, that God has provided in order to prepare His people for His Son Jesus' second coming. But first I will read a statement that is very relevant to this first waymarker here. And that comes from Testimonies, Volume 5, page 452, where I read, "God has revealed what is to take place in the last days, that His people may be prepared to stand against the tempest of opposition and wrath. Those who have been warned of the events before them are not to sit in calm expectation of the coming storm, comforting themselves that the Lord will shelter His faithful ones in the day of trouble. We are to be as men waiting for their Lord, not in idle expectancy, but in earnest work, with unwavering faith. It is no time now to allow our minds to be engrossed with things of minor importance. While men are sleeping, Satan is actively arranging matters so that the Lord's people may not have mercy or justice. Now, in the next two slides, we will be looking at the historical events that have taken place during the short period of trouble referred to by Sister White in Early Writings, page 85, which we covered at the beginning of this study. This period, we will see in the next study, began in 1844 and continues until the close of probation. And as we have seen, Sister White describes this trouble much like phases of a storm, which increases more and more in intensity, and as it approaches, we are admonished to watch these developing events or waymarkers to better help us understand where we are in this short period of trouble, leading up to the close of probation. And with that, we begin with the initial phase of the storm in 1848, where we see the storm of trouble beginning to form on the horizon, with the dark clouds and thunder off in the distance. Now, to save time, I invite you to please pause and read the next two statements from 1848 here. Okay, both these statements from 1848, and especially the last statement, are referring to the year of revolutions of 1848 in Europe, which led to the Italian Risorgimento, which then led to the Roman Question, then to the Crimean War, which signaled the beginning of prophetic trouble, or anger and distress of the nations. Next, we have this waymarker here, 1894, where the outer bands of the storm are forming and storm warnings are being issued. Now, please pause once more and read this statement from 1894, if you will. Once again, we see the time of trouble being used in direct reference to the angry nations here. And what we have seen in this study is that the troubles listed in 1894, the Franco-Russian alliance, which cemented the division of Europe into blocks, which led to World War I, then to the Sino-Japanese War. And then in 1894, we have the Sassoon Massacre, which later led to the Armenian Genocide of 1915. All of these events are a direct result of the revolutions of 1848. And with that, we move on to this next waymarker here, where we see the storm is upgraded and a storm watch goes into effect, so to speak. Now, please pause once again and take some time to read this corresponding statement here from 1904. This statement is very important, and as we have seen previously, 1904 marks the year the world entered upon the time of trouble of Daniel 12:1. And by the way, the statement does not say that we entered into the time of trouble of Daniel 12:1, but upon the time of trouble, or at the doorstep, so to speak. 1904 is a very significant date. In this year began the Russo-Japanese War, which led to the Russian revolutions of 1905 and later 1917, which led to the Triple Entente, and then to the Young Turk Revolution. And this opened the doors for the European powers to start circling the collapsing Ottoman Empire in anticipation of taking over its territories. The Russo-Japanese War and its developments signaled that the long historical prophecy of Daniel 11 was almost finished. The world had entered the final phase of that history, marked by increasing war and instability. God's people were stepping into the opening phase of the time of trouble, a preparatory period before the final crisis, while Christ still ministers in the sanctuary. And moving on to this next and last waymarker here on the slide. 1907. In 1907, the storm makes landfall, so to speak, where the storm takes direct aim at the Ottoman Sultanate. And in this year, we have the Young Turk Committee of Union and Progress, which formed, which then led to the 1908 Young Turk Revolution. And then also in 1907, we have Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, which solidified the U.S. as a global power, which led to its entrance into World War I. Now, please pause once again and take some time to read the corresponding statement here from 1907. Now, the events or prophecies referenced in this statement that were then fulfilling were referring to the events of Revelation 11:18. And notice that the wrath of God was the only event remaining unfulfilled, and that events were then changing or being arranged to bring about the day of God, which hasteth greatly. Now, those of us living today are now watching the very last events taking place, and the final gathering of the nations to the battle of the great day of God. Notice as well that, like birth pangs, the frequency and intensity of these events increases as time progresses. We now come to the next waymarker here in 1922, the eye of the storm, and Daniel 11 being fulfilled. After this event, there was a brief calm resulting from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, before trouble broke out all over the Middle East, over the Palestine question, and the restructuring of the former Ottoman territories, but especially after the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948, a reality only made possible by the resolution of the Eastern question in 1923, and the King of the North coming to his end. Now, to save time, I invite you to please pause once more and read this statement again. Let all read and understand the prophecies of this book, for we are now entering upon the time of trouble spoken of in Daniel 12:1. Reading this again and looking back at history, we see that after the demise of the Ottoman Empire and its being removed as a bulwark, the entire world descended into a new phase of conflicts, what historians today are calling forever wars. And this is exactly what our pioneers predicted would take place when that bulwark was removed. On November 1st, 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate was abolished. Then, on November 17th, 1922, the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, leaves Constantinople for good, which then led to the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne and the final resolution of the Eastern Question. Now, Sister White made this statement at that time because she and her pioneers were well aware of the events taking place, and that they were then entering upon the last scenes that would lead up to the collapse and dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, and ultimately to Michael's standing up. Next, we come to the waymarker of 1939, World War II to present, the sea and the waves roaring. And reading in Luke 21:25, and there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity. The sea and the waves roaring. The sea and the waves here, these would be the populations of the earth. This distress and perplexity is also synonymous of the angry nations of Revelation 11:18, and can be easily observed during World War II. World War II began a new phase of global escalation and is part of the process of the powers of the earth being gathered together by the three unclean spirits, where they are being trained for the continuation of the Battle of Armageddon after the 1,000 years. Now, again, I invite you to please pause and read this statement here from 1890. Okay, many Adventists today are believing that this event, where thousands of ships will be hurled into the depths of the sea, and entire navies will go down and millions of lives sacrificed, is an event that is still awaiting a future fulfillment. But if we just look back at the history of World War II, we will find that this was fulfilled to the letter, as we can see here in some of these statistics. Over the entirety of World War II, more than 20,000 ships were sunk. Entire navies were totally destroyed. Poland, Norway, Yugoslavia, and Greece, for example. 70 to 85 million lives were lost. This fits this statement to the letter. We also see that there would be many disasters on the railway and great lines of travel. And if you haven't noticed, there was a major uptick in the number of train derailments during COVID, and many of those involving hazardous chemicals where entire towns were evacuated. More recently, there have also been many airline disasters, along with very large conflagrations or fires breaking out unexpectedly all around the globe. The next waymarker we come to is Project Esther and Project 2025. Prepare for evacuation. Again, I invite you to please pause and read these two statements here. It is during this period that probation finally closes for the church, while the door of mercy is still open for those who have not had the opportunity to receive the truth. Now, the first part of this paragraph, by the way, this applies to 1844 and the start of the third angel's message, as well as to its close at the end of time. And when those that have taken hold of the truth and have joined with the remnant, it is at that point, when probation has nearly closed, that the wicked blame the remnant for the catastrophic judgments that are coming on the earth, and to bring an end to these disasters, the wicked plot to destroy them. And for those who are interested in how Project Esther and Project 2025 are connected with the final events, please watch my video titled Project Esther and the Threefold Union. I also highly recommend going to the Heritage Foundation's own website and reading the Project Esther document itself, where the plans for the implementation of the no-buy, no-sell law for those deemed as terrorists is very, very clearly laid out there. To put it simply, a terrorist would be anyone opposed to Israel or Zionism. All right, at this next waymarker, we have imminent. The four winds let go. The window for escape has finally closed. This is the final stage and climax of trouble. The four winds are let loose. The window of escape has closed, and the final great time of trouble of Daniel 12:1 commences. The eye wall has passed, and the storm in all of its fury is unleashed after Michael stands up. And we read in Revelation 16, 15, and 18. Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked, and they see his shame. And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. And the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven, from the throne, saying, It is done. And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. And now I will read this corresponding statement from Sister White. That voice shakes the heavens and the earth. There is a mighty earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. The firmament appears to open and shut. The glory from the throne of God seems flashing through. The mountains shake like a reed in the wind, and ragged rocks are scattered on every side. There is a roar as of a coming tempest. The sea is lashed into fury. There is heard the shriek of a hurricane, like the voice of demons upon a mission of destruction. The whole earth heaves and swells like the waves of the sea. Its surface is breaking up. Its very foundations seem to be giving away. Mountain chains are sinking. Inhabited islands disappear. The seaports that have become like Sodom for wickedness are swallowed up by the angry waters. Babylon the Great has come in remembrance before God, to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Great hailstones, every one about the weight of a talent, are doing their work of destruction. The proudest cities of the earth are laid low. The lordly palaces upon which the world's great men have lavished their wealth in order to glorify themselves are crumbling to ruin before their eyes. Prison walls are rent asunder, and God's people who have been held in bondage for their faith are set free. Maranatha, page 280. Now, all of Sister White's time of trouble statements that we have covered, these are consistent and can be reconciled when we look at the trouble as an escalating process of war. Each event being a waymarker, signaling a marked increase in the trouble and destruction produced by the storm of wars. This trouble is synonymous with the judgments which are poured out with mercy and continue to worsen as God's Spirit is withdrawn from the earth, until all restraint is finally removed and judgment is poured out without mercy. Lastly, a warning requires a length of time, sometimes many generations, to be either accepted or rejected. Since 1844, we have been living in the antitypical days of Noah, and the storm warnings have been sounding for well over 120 years now. And the time for our preparation is quickly coming to an end. And may God help us to share with others the last warning message and to lead others to the sanctuary found in Christ and His righteousness, represented by the seventh-day Sabbath. Okay, after going through the history of wars and revolutions in this study, this statement from A.T. Jones should carry greater significance. And I read, "Who is ready for this time of trouble such as never was, since there was a nation? Who? Whoever on the earth is not ready for the spreading over all nations of such a time of trouble as never was, since there was a nation. Whoever on earth is not ready for this, is not ready for the wiping out of the Ottoman power. Therefore, instead of churches and pulpits and religious papers calling for war and urging the wiping of the Turkish power off the earth, they would better, far better, be preaching the gospel of peace, which they profess, and which they are so basely perverting, and by the sincere preaching of the gospel of peace, be preparing to stand in peace and quietness in God, when this time of trouble shall break upon the world at the time of the ending of the Ottoman Empire. Who is doing this work? Who is ready for the time of trouble? For this is not simply a great time of trouble by war amongst the nations. It is even more than this. It is a time of trouble caused by this, and also by the judgments of God upon the earth, and the coming of the Lord, the resurrection of the dead, and the end of all things. This is emphasized by the other portion of Scripture which treats of the Ottoman power. In the 16th chapter of Revelation, from beginning to end, is the Lord's record of the 7 last plagues, in which is filled up the wrath of God, to be poured upon the earth, and which of itself is the greatest element of this time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation. All right, all that we have seen over the last 100 years in the Middle East and globally, since the removal of the Ottoman bulwark, is one war after another, with no end in sight. And A.T. Jones appears to have predicted this outcome very accurately, and even though it was likely Jacob's trouble, which he expected to quickly follow the wiping out of the Ottoman power, it should be clear as day, however, for anyone who has been paying attention to history, that the majority of what is being described here has been in the process of fulfillment for the last 100 years, and that very soon Michael will be standing up. Also, in this article, the churches during that time who were preaching about wiping the Ottoman Empire off the map were those churches who were looking for the return of the Jews to Israel, and the Ottoman Empire was the only thing preventing this from taking place. Jerusalem was a part of the Ottoman Empire's dominion, and they would not relinquish control over this territory willingly. Therefore, the empire must come to an end. Jerusalem is the stage, and it is being set for the crowning act in the great drama of deception, Satan appearing as Christ. The fact that there is a state of Israel at all today, and the belief by most all of Christianity that God is behind this, and the return of the Jews to their so-called homeland, is the number one evidence that Daniel 11:45 has indeed been fulfilled. We will now conclude with part 1 of this study. And as we have seen, the world has indeed been stirred with the spirit of war. It has been and still is in a state of trouble. This trouble has been increasing for over 100 years now, and will increase more and more until the earth is rid of the wicked. In this study, we have seen how this trouble has been escalating, beginning with the year of revolutions in the year 1848. These revolutions then led to the Roman question, which then led to the Crimean War of 1853. Then in 1894, we have the Franco-Russian alliance, which led to the Sino-Japanese War. Also in the same year, we have the Sassoon massacre, which led to the Armenian genocide of 1915, which was carried out by the Young Turks. Then, in 1904, we have the Russo-Japanese War, which led to the Russian Revolution of 1905, which further led to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. This then led to the Triple Entente, which emboldened the Young Turks to revolution in 1908. Also in 1904, America had entered the global diplomatic arena, with Theodore Roosevelt's signing of the Treaty of Portsmouth at the close of the Russo-Japanese War. Then, in 1907, we have the Triple Entente and its completion, which led to the Young Turks and their formation of the Committee for Union and Progress, which led to World War I, which led to the ultimate demise and collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Also in 1907, Theodore Roosevelt's Great White Fleet took sail around the world, which solidified the U.S. as a global power. Now, we have seen how this history and the Spirit of Prophecy statements covered so far are connected with the Eastern question, and that these events contributed to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the King of the North. There is still more to this study, however, and by God's grace, we will continue this in part 2. But before closing, I want to share this excerpt from a Review and Herald article dated September 30th, 1909, by Percy McGann, which we will explore further in part 2. In it, he describes very well the retroactive principle that was mentioned earlier in this study. The historical events that we have been witnessing are, as Brother McGann states, the sixth plague in the making. It alone can be observed shaping up. It is the only one that men can watch in the course of preparation. The sixth plague is the great sign plague, to give warning, not only of itself, but of all the plagues. For when men see this plague in the making, they must know that not only is the pouring out of it near at hand, but that the 5 others which precede it are nearer still. Therefore, Revelation 16:15 calls upon men to watch. We are to watch the garments of our character, and especially and particularly are we to watch this sixth plague. We are to behold it, and to watch and observe its progress, and as we see it approaching, prepare our souls for the great day of God, which it ushers in. This is the only plague, the coming of which men can watch. And with that, I will close with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you and praise you for the life that you have given us through your Son Jesus. And although the time has been prolonged due to our unfaithfulness, I thank you for your long suffering and your mercy, and for your holding back the 4 winds. And I pray that you will continue to hold these winds until your people are all sealed. I pray also that we may be settled into the truth, and that we may be a part of the 144,000. And that this information may glorify you, Father, and help others to prepare to meet your Son Jesus when he comes in the clouds of glory. And I pray this in his most glorious and holy name. Amen.